All right, we have Collin Kelly and Jackson Lanzing here. Welcome y'all to Friends from Work.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
We are, in fact, friends from work, so we feel like this is very appropriate.
Wow. That's perfect. That's actually one of the main reasons we got you on here is we just try to stay very thematic.
I get it. You find like two guys who just love talking at the water cooler. You're like, you should come on our podcast. I get it.
Right.
I am, however, interested in enemies from work, which I think would be also a very delicious podcast.
Oh, true. Just all of the office drama, gossip, tea.
Exactly.
Although at that point it's like less the water cooler and more like what the tea pitcher. That's not the word.
Tea shop. Yes. Tea shop. The office tea shop. I suppose.
Tea Shop Civil War coming to theaters next year.
Well, speaking of friends, like you said, my understanding is y'all have known each other for a long time and have been working together as a writing duo for a long time. This is, we've gotten to talk to a lot of comics creators and then also a lot of folks kind of in TV writing rooms. But I'm always curious to hear, what does that process look like? How did y'all come to work as a duo? And how does that factor into you starting up a project like Kang, which is kind of the first book of yours we'll talk about today?
Sure. Yeah. So we met in college, just the sort of the way that you tend to meet other writers, which is you're immediately rivals. We met through our mutual friend David Server, who I was writing a book with, like my very first comic of something called Freak Show that Dave had basically created, and I sort of helped him bring to life. And while we were going through that process, Collin was Dave's roommate, and truthfully, I was like, oh, here's this cool guy, like we should hang out.
And frankly, I kind of hated him, right? Like Dave was my best friend, and then suddenly this other guy sweeps in with all of his cool ideas, and it was really quite despicable. However, then Dave was the only one with a car, so we all had to pile into the same PT Cruiser and drive across town for our Wednesday books. So when we were all picking up the same stack of comic books every week. And then we'd sit down with greasy pizza, and with our little heretic greasy fingers, we'd be reading our comic books and screaming at each other. And through that kind of comic book relationship, we started to build a shared vocabulary. Yes, we were yelling at each other, but that is what the creative process is, and so often, right? So by building that kind of creative vocabulary, then Jack and I ended up in a writing group, and I started to realize like his work was just this really kind of very small, focused, character-driven stuff that was just really impactful.
And meanwhile, Collin's work was very like big and bombastic and creative and imaginative, and he was writing these big like $350 million, time travel movies. And I was like, I didn't know you could do that. And so I think both of us looked at the other, and suddenly it was like, we gained the power of mutual respect, Boom! And like it just kind of changed both of our lives. And so we started writing together. Wow. Basically right after graduation, found we had a very similar vibe in sort of screenwriting. And then as we did the screenwriting dance for a few years and learned how brutal and kind of intense Hollywood could be, even at the level that we were at, which was like we were, selling studio movies and like working on studio projects, and it was still like a very rough road. We, meanwhile, had our origin story had always been about comics, and it had been about how the comics that we love. We were still going to the store, getting our comics, talking about comics, and we thought, hey, maybe we should try doing some comics. And that kind of took over our career fundamentally, because once we realized that we could write something and 6 months later it could come out, that we could work with incredible artists, that we could tell amazing stories with characters that had meant the world to us growing up, it was just a whole new ballgame. And it really changed the way that we worked. And so, yeah, we've been doing this now for 14 years.
14 years?
Yeah, something like that.
And that kind of actually dovetails really nicely. I like that you tagged Kang as the first thing to talk about, because Kang came about through a really interesting process. Obviously, coming through Hollywood, coming through, kind of where our perspective was at, we were telling really personal stories, right? Like, yes, you got to have the explosions. Absolutely, you need to, blow up buildings and have dinosaurs and have all of that great stuff. But we always like to say, just like Jack's original work, when you strip all that out, it has to work in a black box. And you have to write what you know. And people are always getting confused by that. They think write what you know means like, well, I'm a cop, so I got to write about cops. No. The write what you know means you know about heartbreak. So you must write about heartbreak. And one of the things Jack and I do share is very complicated relationships with our fathers. Very, sure, some good stuff, but a lot of toxic stuff and a lot of internalized bad juice.
Yeah, a lot of internalized bad juice. Yep.
And we realized, so that was a story that there was like a demon that we needed to get out of us. And we were talking about this and kind of circling back to kind of my origins, like big time travel. How can we take this story and turn it into something large? Which is kind of when we crossed paths with Alana Smith. And kind of over at Marvel, she picked us up just kind of as guys. She really liked our work Joyride at Studios.
Yeah, we'd been talking to her about what we might do. We met the previous year, right before pandemic, 2019. We were like, we're going to start doing some work at Marvel because we'd been at DC. We had sort of run out of runway there after the cancellation of Green Arrow. We were like, we really want to find some new horizons. And we'd always been huge Marvel fans. We'd gone to Marvel and been like, hey, Alana, will you please meet with us? She met with us. She pegged immediately. She was like, you guys would be really good for Steve Rogers. And we laughed. We're like, ha ha ha, we'll never get to write Steve Rogers. That's insane. But so cool that you think that. And she asked us for some pitches. And we pitched a bunch of really small ball stuff. Stuff that little 4-issue minis or one shots, just stuff we thought would maybe go between the lines, would feel like it would be additive to the universe. And it was basically a pass across the board on all of that because either the characters were being used or because the stories just didn't feel like they needed to happen. And so we were back then, pandemic happened, and here we are back in that conversation, just talking about what we would need to write about personally. And we come up with this story about time travel and about how one tries to avoid oneself and how if your life was a time loop and was an inescapable time loop, not a time loop like a Groundhog Day, but a time loop you are going to constantly become the thing that messes you up. How do you shake that toxicity? How do you shake that stuff that, as we put it, that internalized bad juice that you're left with by your father, right? What does it mean to, in some ways, be your own father and recognize that a lot of that stuff that you put on your father is actually stuff that you are perpetuating? And I don't know which one of us said it, but I think we were literally just talking over the phone because we couldn't meet in person the whole pandemic. Right. So we're just pacing around our houses on the phone. Yeah. And one of us goes, you know what? Or what? This would be such a better story if it was a Kang the Conqueror book because it just would work for Kang. This is exactly what Kang goes through. And we were both like, well, yeah, but who's going to do a Kang the Conqueror book? And we just struck out of Marvel. I don't know if that's going to happen. But nice that, it was a cool idea.
Yeah, and we had just been oh, well, all of us smaller characters we pitched had just got shot down. So, we're going to come back to them with a Kang book? Absolutely. Who cares about Kang?
And then Jonathan Majors. Literally, we turned in this pitch. Jonathan Majors got cast, and we were like, kismet, this is going to happen. And then 2 weeks later, we had a go book because not only did we have a desperate personal desire to tell a Kang the Conqueror story about stuff that was very personal and real to us. But at the same time, Marvel had an absolute need to produce Kang the Conqueror comics that could get people on board and get people on page for Quantumania. So it was kind of this perfect synergy between what the company needs and what the universe needs and what we needed. And I was just, I really just, we're so lucky to have fallen into that framework so that Only Myself Left to Conquer was able to get, produced and produced at the quality that it was.
Wow, that was going to be my next question, is because I believe the first issue of the series came out, a month or two after the Loki finale, when we would have gotten our first, sort of peak of King, sort of.
Yeah, I think the month after, yeah.
Well, and how's this for Kismet? Because obviously, we're like, oh, Jonathan Majors, Kang is going to be a big deal. Amazing. What delightful Kismet for this book coming out. And then the first episode drops. And, even though we're in the Marvel family, it's not like we get preview screenings or anything. So we were watching Loki 1 with everyone else. And then Ravana shows up. And we're like, holy, you cannot tell a story about fathers without telling a story about the women who make them, right? It is really about how you define yourself, about who you fall in love with is so important. So Ravana was huge to our story. And talk about, no offense to her, but D-lister. I mean,
not a character that many people know. When we initially pitched the book, Ravana wasn't a huge part of it. And then the more that we dug into the actual origins of the character, reread the fiction, the more that we were like, well, Ravana's kind of the key to the whole character. If you don't have Ravana, Kang doesn't make a lot of mistakes that he makes. He blames a lot of it on Kang, but it's actually Ravonna and his desire to be this person for her that he doesn't know how to be. Like, oh man, this is a story. So we put Ravonna in the book, but we're like, man, I hope people access this because who knows who Ravonna is? And then suddenly Ravonna's on television.
Yeah.
Yes.
And again, talk about excellent casting.
Oh my God, I know.
I mean,
I know.
Yep.
We were thrilled. And I mean, so, but then of course, several weeks later, He Who Remains shows up. And we are once again treated to a big surprise. And suddenly realize why it is that Marvel has dated Kang the Conqueror #1 when it has, right? They know, but we don't.
Okay.
So the kismet of that book I don't think that happens in a vacuum. I think that happens in the room of very clever people who know how they're ordering a universe and know how they're building this fiction out. We just happen to be the recipients of that because we had this Kang thing ready to go, and it was sort of properly established to do that. So that was a really lovely additional bit of kismet for us to suddenly see the beginning of Majors' portrayal of this character and such a iconic immediately portrayal of it anyway.
Oh man,
immediately we went back to tables and we were like, oh, I want to write as Immortus. Like, oh, I love this character. It was a blast. So yeah, very, very cool to see.
Man, it's so fun reading this story and realizing how much you either knew about Kang coming into the project or had to learn through, some extensive research. You see so many little bits of the continuity either shouted out to or made, focus of certain issues. So we're speaking the week that Ant-Man the Wasp Quantumania releases, and a lot of folks that just watch MCU projects, particularly those that watch more casually, will be familiar maybe with He Who Remains and sort of recognize the connection, obviously through the actor. But a lot of folks will have really no idea who Kang is, and so I feel like who better qualified to maybe introduce some folks to the character of Kang the Conqueror than a couple writers that have clearly spent a lot of time digging through the history of that character.
Yeah. I mean, I think so as I said, we sort of had a personal start to this and we said, okay, this is going to be a story about fathers and sons and a story about how we deal with toxic cycles. But then, you get the green light and you say, okay, suddenly we really have to dig into Kang's history. And one of the things to shout out is working with Tom Brevoort. Tom is he's the most Marvel editor alive. He has been doing this longer than anyone in history has been doing this. He is a font of knowledge and wisdom as regards how you tell stories like this. And so we got on this, and the first thing that we got from Tom was like, love this pitch, love the idea, love how it's all squared away, rethink the whole middle. Rethink what issues 3 and 4 look like. Because right now you're pitching me new stories. What I want to see is how this stuff is new, but also fits into the Kang continuity that we know. If you're going to show me the time loop, show me the time loop. Yeah. And so that meant we had to go into his history and say, okay, what about this character is fundamentally, like if I was to tell you in 5 issues the entire history of Kang the Conqueror, which is an impossible task, what would we want to tell you? And so we sat down and said, what are our favorite things? What are things you definitely can't move? You can't move Rama Tut, right? You need Rama Tut. You need the year 3000. You need the 30th century versions.
He needs to earn the Conqueror title.
Right. You need to become a conqueror. You need him to meet Ravonna and have a sort of complicated relationship with Ravonna, right? But not the relationship that we know. If we're just seeing the relationship we've seen in the comics, if this is just a recap comic, then we've done something wrong. This needs to be something new. It needs to be not just informative, but actually take you along a new story. So if you haven't read anything, suddenly you have a way to see Kang in light for the first time. And if you've read everything, ideally suddenly you're seeing Kang in a new light because you're getting pulled into all of the old issues, all the way back to Jack Kirby's initial conceptions of the character. And that was really our North Star is can you be a super fan of the comics and read this and get something new out of it, but also be a completely casual reader who's only just encountered this through the MCU and get a shot at really understanding what's great about the character. And that's a hell of a challenge. And maybe for a character less verbose than Kang, that would have been a little trickier. The lovely thing about Kang is that when he says something, he says it. And he uses 20 words where he could use 5. So it really lets you, like, if Kang the Conqueror has a fault, it's that it's overwritten, but that's not a fault because it's Kang.
Yeah, subtlety is for other people, not Kang. So it's really convenient when you just need someone to say the exposition and Kang is like, ha! Kang is here to tell you exactly what he's here to say. And you're like, thank you, bless.
Yeah.
The monologuing is so key. No, that's a great point.
It's so delicious to write. I mean, like, there's a reason, like, Kang and Doom, and there's, like, these seminal villains who keep showing up. It's because writers love them, man. They are a blast to write.
Yeah. Yeah. Never turned down a chance to write Dr. Doom, which is why, obviously, he had to show up. Like, my favorite of the time loops is issue 3 is all about Kang's first appearance as Kang the Conqueror and the true story of Kang trying to and spoiler alert, succeeding at assassinating himself in that moment and effectively replacing himself, thinking that that's going to solve the problem, but ultimately just learning that it's that act of violence, it's that act of self-cruelty that's going to turn him into the person that he's becoming. Like, that's the moment his soul dies a little bit. And he doesn't realize that by doing that action, he is destroying himself. He knows literally that he's destroying himself, but he doesn't understand figuratively that he's destroying himself. And, like, taking that, which is a new beat, and putting that into the middle of a comic that came out 60 years ago is a really, like, wonderful trick that you don't get to pull in comics a lot because this stuff really is set in stone. So it was just an absolute blast.
Man, well, did you have any takeaways? You know, we've talked some about what drives him. I love what you're saying about kind of these cycles of toxicity and like the way that factors into our own relationships and how we see that mirrored. I mean, my wife and I, we read this for our Comics Corner episode and kind of talked about it. And I love that you're talking about coming to the story as someone that's read a lot of King comics versus none, because that's she and I in this context. I'm curious, you know, again, having spent all the time you have now with the character, as people are looking at, you know, not just a film with Kang, but also, you know, a whole, you know, saga really that Marvel Studios has told us is, you know, going to be pretty rooted in Major's performances. What do you think really makes Kang the Conqueror such a special character and such a, you know, pardon the pun, timeless Marvel villain? I really didn't plan that. I'm sorry.
No, but it was beautiful. You're good at this. I think there's something really interesting about Kang, and it comes back to kind of our original concept, which is these cycles of toxic abuse, effectively. And the idea that you can be incredible, like there are a few things more sympathetic than a young person, faced with the challenges of their parents, faced with the world that has turned against them and telling them that they cannot be the best version of themselves, right? Something that's holding you down and saying you can only be small. Or you can only be cruel, right? You can only be this. And then for you to rail against that, like that is every hero's journey. But Kang doesn't learn the lesson, right? Kang cannot get out of his own way. And that kind of egoism, that drive to, that chip on his shoulder that pushes him to be the best version of himself is exactly what pushes him back to the very man that he never wanted to be, right? And I think that's the difference. That's a villain turn, right? And that's the core. No matter when he succeeds, by succeeding, he proves himself to be a villain, right? And that's not a judgment necessarily. It's a tragedy. And I think that's the key, is like he is a tragic figure, and in that tragedy becomes cruel, which is endlessly fascinating.
I think, and to back that up, to look at him in conjunction to the other character that now MCU fans are sort of familiar with in terms of being like a large-scale big bad, that being Thanos, right? The MCU Thanos is positioned in some ways as more of a tragedy than... in some ways, it's more of a tragedy, in some ways less of a tragedy than Comics Thanos, because Comics Thanos has this fundamental objective, which is that he is in love with death. right? Which is a very esoteric concept. Thanos doesn't have some sort of like great objective for like resource scarcity. Thanos wants Death to love him back. And so was just going to keep feeding Death until she loves him back. And it's the thing I love the very, very most about Donny Cates's Thanos run, incidentally, is that he finally is able to frame it as the tragedy that it is. That at the very, very end of Thanos is the only thing left. Death still doesn't love him because she's just a thing he can kill, or he's just a thing she can kill. Like that's that fundamental tragedy of Thanos is really, really powerful. But to me, when you make it a resource scarcity argument, I don't think it's as tragic. I think it's sad that he couldn't recognize his children. I think it's sad that he doesn't have the relationship with his daughters that he wants. I think that's sad and it is interesting and tragic. But at the core of it, Thanos is a man possessed by a bad argument. He's kind of the guy who's been like red pilled. On the flip side of it, Kang is a person. Kang isn't just a person. I guess Kang is a bunch of people, all of whom are written across time, screwing one another over. And I think they all have the best of intentions. I think they want to be good people. I think in a vacuum, we're proven this by Iron Lad, by a character who is Kang at the very beginning of his moral compass, before the first act of great cruelty is done to him, where his throat is slit, right? Which is where we pick him up in our book. Our book is effectively the third volume of Young Avengers, because we really are picking up with that Kang, right? But that Kang, at his initial origin, he chooses heroism. And the only reason he can't stick to it is because Kang has already made those bad choices, and that by making those bad choices, they have written them into the time stream. And so Iron Lad can't stay Iron Lad. He has to become Kang, because otherwise the time stream will collapse. So, like, the entire universe has been written against this man who's trying desperately to push out of it. And he thinks it's the universe that's doing it. And it's not. It's him. It was always him. And like, what a villain turn to realize that it's not other people misusing resources or someone who doesn't love you back or any. No, it's just you, him. Man. Yeah, he's the problem. It's him. Man will go to therapy. Man will time travel 100 times before going to therapy. That's Kang the Conqueror.
Yeah. And
I really do think it's just he's more relatable than, even though he's like big and bombastic and Dr. Doomy and crazy, he's to me the most relatable villain in the Marvel canon, because he just wants to be a good person.
And ironically, I think, interestingly enough, just as we're talking about the MCU of it all, like I think MCU Thanos was kind of a sad distillation of who he could have been. Like we kind of talked about it. I think MCU Kang, we are going to get a lot more of the potential heroism of this character. They're going to really be able to unpack the good man he could be. Like, obviously, he is still going to have many, many villain turns. But, like, I'm very excited to see what they do with that character.
I mean, when we've already seen it with He Who Remains, which I think is really cool, right? Knowing nothing about Quantumania, but just knowing that He Who Remains as a fundamental concept says Kang solved Kang. He solved it. Kang solved Kang by locking away Kang and putting himself into a space where he had to be alone for the rest of time and kind of go insane and like be immortus, but he could keep the sacred timeline going.
Which is correct, by the way. If you cannot escape the toxicity of your own life, if everything you touch turns to the only ethical thing to do is to remove step away from things where you cannot rot what is around you. And it's such a great place to start that Kang, because it means it's all downhill.
Yeah. Like he's already solved the problem. And then Loki has reopened the problem. So now that the problem is Loki, so it creates cool, man.
Yeah. He's even trying to do that even further by handing over the reins to Loki and Sylvie and fully take himself kind of off the board.
Yep.
And then obviously that doesn't work.
Doesn't work. Turns out people don't like it when you tell them what to do. Because even there, Kang is wrong, right? He knows there's a fundamental aspect of him that needs that control, even when he's giving it away.
Hey, Robbie, friends from work, thank you guys so much for having us. This is Collin signing off for Jack and myself. I hope everyone enjoys Kang. Check out Captain America and our soon-to-be upcoming Guardians of the Galaxy. Thank you all from Los Angeles.
And thank you all so much for being on Friends for Work. We will talk to y'all soon about all sorts of things.
Cheers, guys. Talk to you soon.